Welcome back. We're continuing to talk about functional groups. Just to review, we've talked about two different ways of adding a single oxygen to a hydrocarbon structure. And so let's just do a quick review. The first way was to have an oxygen that is bridging two atoms, carbon and or hydrogen. And so the possibilities were this: a carbon group, remember R represents a carbon or a group of carbons, connected to an oxygen, connected to a hydrogen. So in this group, an oxygen bridges a carbon group and a hydrogen. And again, this functional group is called alcohol. Okay, so anything that contains a carbon connected to an oxygen connected to hydrogen is an alcohol. The other way of putting a single oxygen in here with two single bonds is to connect the oxygen to two different carbon groups. And so now oxygen is bridging two carbons, and we use the R sub A and R sub B designations to indicate that those are potentially different carbon groups, and this is called an ether. The other possibility is where we add a carbon-oxygen double bond, where carbon is double bonded to oxygen, and the two possibilities there were a carbon group connected to the carbon-oxygen double bond combination connected to a hydrogen, and we call that an aldehyde. Or the situation where there are two carbon groups attached to the carbonyl, and again using the same designation R sub A, R sub B, indicating that the carbon groups can be different, and this was called a ketone. So just a little pause here to make sure everybody sees the similarity in patterns here. So in the alcohol and ether, the oxygen with single bonds is the focal point, and then what's connected to that oxygen is the thing that distinguishes it, whether it's an alcohol or an ether. So in the alcohol case, we've got a carbon group and a hydrogen group attached. Okay. In the ether, we've got the same central feature, oxygen with two single bonds, but now that oxygen is connected to two carbons. So notice the difference. We come down to the aldehyde and ketone, and we see a similar pattern. In this case, the central focus is this carbonyl group, that carbon-oxygen double bond with two more connections. And then we pay attention to what's connected to that carbon-oxygen double bond combination. Again, we see the same pattern. Two possibilities. One side is connected by a carbon group. One side is connected by a hydrogen. Okay, so notice the similarity between here and here. The other possibility is that there are two carbon groups on both sides of the central feature. Again, notice the similarity, therefore, between the pattern in the ketone and the pattern in the ether. Okay, so that's kind of a nice way to kind of keep those separate. So there's some similarities, yet there's some differences. So recognizing patterns. Because it is the pattern or the structure of these functional groups that give them their functions, their properties. Okay, so now what we're going to do is add two carbons. So let me get some more room here. So we're going to add two carbons. Okay, so adding two carbons. Add two carbons. So now the functional groups that we're going to be talking about now have two carbons. And the feature of all of these functional groups is that they all contain this as the central feature. A carbon-oxygen double bond, we've seen that before, connected to an oxygen. And so although that's not a functional group by itself, okay, we call this the carboxyl group. And just like above, what's connected to the carboxyl group, and again, we have a connection that can go this way, and we have a connection that can go this way. What's connected here and here distinguishes between these two next function groups. Okay, so we use the same pattern we used before. Okay, one possibility is to have a carbon group connected here and a hydrogen on this side. So there's our carboxyl group. And again, notice the pattern. We're using the same pattern we used above. Carbon on one side, hydrogen on the other side. This functional group is called carboxylic acid. Okay. Carboxylic acid, another new functional group. Okay. New functional group, carboxylic acid. Carboxylic acids are incredibly important in organic chemistry. Many foods, for example, contain carboxylic acids. Any food that has a sour taste to it, like vinegar, lemon, things like that, citrus fruit, okay, contains an acid. Acids are sour in taste. So anything that's sour probably has some carboxylic acid in it. Those are carboxylic acids. For example, this is the acid that is present in vinegar. It is called officially ethanoic acid. You're not surprised by that name, I hope. No surprises about the name. Ethanoic acid. I hope by this point, when you see the eth part, you're thinking to yourself, that means 2 carbons. And notice that ethanoic acid has 2 carbons. But it shares that pattern that makes it a carboxylic acid. Okay. All right. Good. That's a carboxylic acid. And when we talk about acids, we're usually talking about acidic hydrogens. And this little hydrogen over here is called later on we'll talk about that, acidic H. That may be getting a little ahead of ourselves. All right. So carboxylic acids, sort of like ethers, are always found on the edges of the molecule because they end in H. So again, we can think of a carboxylic acid as being a dead end group. Hope that makes a little bit of sense. Okay, dead end group. Okay, carboxylic acids tend to be fairly reactive, in part because they are a dead end group. They are found on the outside of the molecule where they are more likely to react. Hope that makes a little bit of sense. The other possibility, go back up to our main structure here. We've got the carbon double bonded to an oxygen, singly bonded to an oxygen. And now, just as we did before, now what we're going to do is we're going to say we have to have 2 carbon groups about that situation. So again, here's our main focal point, that carboxyl group. And now it's connected to the carboxyl group. There's a carbon group on one side and a carbon group on the other side. Okay. This type of a functional group is called an ester. Don't get esters confused with ethers. They both start with E, but they're very different structures. Esters. Okay. Esters tend to be molecules that are tasty and fragrant. So if you smell a nice aroma, good chance it could be an ester. Right. So a simple ester would be putting a 1 carbon group on this side connected to that carbon oxygen double bond, connected to another carbon group. If we fill in all the hydrogens, there would be our simplest ester. Okay. Again, as we're looking at this, the first thing we recognize is we've got that carbon-oxygen double bond combination. And then we focus on what is connected to that. We've got a carbon on one side and a carbon on the other side, so that characterizes as an ester. Notice the close relationship again between carboxylic acids and esters. The carboxylic acid always has the hydrogen here. The ester always has a carbon group attached to the oxygen. Big difference there. Big difference there. Okay. Again, other thing is that esters are a bridging group. Notice that esters, like ethers and ketones, bridge carbons. So esters can appear in the middle of a carbon group, whereas acids are always going to appear on the outside. Okay, so esters are not a dead end group. So those are carboxylic acids and esters. Okay.